So I just mentioned that the Padmavat is not only significant as a text which was written in Avdi in 16th century, but you have a series of Premakhyans that were written in during those period. One of the earliest one, of course, is that of Maulana Daud, which was his text was known as Chandayan. It was written in 1379, and this was written somewhere when Firuz Shah Tughlaq was ruling. Then you have Kutban's Mrigavati, which was written in 1503 by of course, Qutban wrote it, and then at that time, the ruler was Hussain Shah Sharki. So it was under the patronage of the Sharki ruler, Hussain Shah Sharki, that Mrigavati was written. This is the third in the series of Premakhyans that we normally read. So there are many other, but then these are the four popular ones. So the third is Malik Muhammad Jayasi's Padmavat, which was written in 1540, and at that time Sher Shah was ruling. And the fourth one is Manjhan's Madhumalati, which was written 5 years after Padmavat was written, that is in 1545, and at that time Islam Shah was the ruler. So we take up various issues related to such Premakhyans, the Premakhyans which were written, and of course in the context of Padmavat. So do we consider Padmavat as one in the series of various Premakhyans that exist today? Is it part of that series? And so the other question that is very important for us is about the the background of the poet. Who is the poet? What is his background? So does it actually matter? And is this the political climate of the time also very important when such texts were being written? So for example, when Padmavat was being composed in 1540, what was the political climate of the time? So is that of some importance for a historian who reads it today? Can we also see it as some kind of a creation of a new media in the form of writing didactic stories to spread some kind of message to the people who were assembling and listening to the such Premakhyans, the such love stories? And another very interesting thing about this is the kinds of models that the Premakhyans emulated, particularly Padmavat. And what kind of elements, like we talk about elements such as epic, the Nath tradition, the Masnavi tradition. So what are these minor or major influences coming from these earlier traditions that exist? And lastly, we would also see if Padmavati, the character, the main character, the lead character in the text Padmavat, is she a mythical character or is she a historical character? And then how do these issues actually matter to us as historians? So these are few of the questions that we raise, and then we try to figure out whether Padmavat actually is able to give us some answers to these questions. Now, Premakhyans, as they were written in various centuries, different centuries, and the I have already mentioned in earlier lectures that the vernacular literatures should not be treated as just as stories, because they also have significance. Earlier historians were not treating it as history because of it's, and they branded it as ahistorical. And one of the reasons was, of course, the mythical stories that it contained. But now that we have already discussed that even vernacular literatures are of significance for historians, so then we realize that the historical agents of the Indo-Islamic literary culture that emerged at that time, they were not the just the it is the kind of literature that were growing. It was not just the courtiers of Delhi Sultanate, or those chroniclers who were writing for Delhi Sultanate, or for the Afghan rulers, that they were not the only element. I mean, they were not the only people who were writing about for it. The Sufis, the sheikhs, they were also the people who wrote the romances, and they wrote it in local languages. So if you the local language, when I say local language, it is normally the Awadhi, that which is sometimes also known as Hindavi. So although Amir Khusro, who was there in the first half of the 14th century, he is also credited with the introduction of Hindvi poetry, but none of the early written manuscripts survive to actually testify Amir Khusro's literary creativity in Hindvi. So we although know that in many books today we find that Amir Khusro is given credit for this. So the point is that as a text, as a manuscript, it doesn't survive. But then we find, the later versions in many of the literatures. And Amir Khusro was a disciple and a very close friend of Nizamuddin Aulia, as we know. Now, one of the first and the earliest surviving longer composition in Hindvi is not that of Amir Khusro, of course. I'm talking about the surviving text. It's actually coming from Maulana Daud's work, which is Chandayan, which was written in 1379. And as I mentioned, that Maulana Daud was a courtier under Firoz Shah Tughlaq. And Maulana Daud actually was also a disciple of Sheikh Jainuddin Chishti, who was the nephew of Mahmud Chirag-e-Dilli. And many of you know that Chirag-e-Dilli was the successor of Nizamuddin Aulia, Delhi mein, right? So next work that we see in Hindvi after that, major work, is of course Qutban's Mrigavati, which was written in 1503. Now the models that we see in Chandayan and Mrigavati is actually emulated very powerfully in many of the later Hindvi texts, like we see Malik Muhammad Jayasi's Padmavat or Manjhan's Madhumalti. In both these texts we find that the models that were actually followed in Chandayan and Mrigavati, they were also imbibed in these later texts. And in all these four Premakhyans we find that the authors have used the same framework. They all, when I say framework, I'm suggesting that all of them actually drew on the conventions of Persian Masnavi tradition. So they framed their romances. These are all love stories. So they framed their romances, very much similar to the Masnavi story, which was uh, the Masnavis were written, they were actually written in Persian by Jalaluddin Balkhi. He was a Sufi saint of 13th century. And Masnavi normally considered to be a poetic collection of the anecdotes and the stories derived from Quran, Hadith, and everyday tales that exist. So all the four authors they use this Masnavi element in their text, and they also like Masnavi. They praise the God when they begin the text. They will praise the God, then the Prophet Muhammad, then the Caliph, and then the king. The king would come at the third place after under whom the text was written. And the last thing that all these four authors mention is about the spiritual guide. So they thank the spiritual guide who has inspired them to write such texts. And most of these stories, like we find, like Masnavi, we have stories set in the ambience of the court. King is always there in all these stories, king and queen. So it's all about story of king and queen. And we will find such all these description of marvelous palaces and gardens and the local surroundings and things like that. Now, most of these literatures, when I say that they had some kind of influence coming from earlier literature, I say this with some kind of a, the some kind of influence that is coming from, and that has been mentioned by many modern day historians. Now, if you look at the many of the works of the scholars who have written on Sufism, particularly Indian Sufism, for example, the work of Nizami or Simon Digby, or take the example of Richard Eaton, even Carl Ernst and Bruce Lawrence. So they all they have given primary importance to the kind of devotionalism or devotional movement that was going on at that time, or the popularity that these various Chistis and the Shuaravardis acquired during those days. And they all emphasize on the complex social role of the Sufis, especially when these become host to large scale popular cult of holy men's tomb. So the Chishti lineage, to which Jayasi actually claims allegiance, was formed when congregation broke up in several local branches. The historians who have worked on such literatures, they talk about the social context also, about when they discuss about the literatures such as Padmavat. Now, Aditya Bahel's one of the works that I always mention, everyone should read his book, Love's Subtle Magic. In that book, he actually writes about the three different patterns or the languages that the authors, the Premakhyan authors, actually followed at that time. And he says that it is actually somewhat similar to what Sheldon Pollock suggested about the cosmopolitan influence. So he mentions about Pollock's cosmopolitan influences coming from Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit. So there were, in addition to the the different variety of regional influences coming from regional literatures in the form of Apabhransh or Prakrit, there were also influences coming from the cosmopolitan languages, or the literature of the cosmopolitan languages. And the four Premakhyans, those which were written in Avdi, they actually appropriated a number of tropes from various earlier narrative tradition coming from late ancient times. And the production of similar narrative in medieval India, such as the stories of Usha, Niruddha, Nal, Damayanti, these are all also playing some role in when these compositions were being done. So they indicate that they continued to circulate in 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, when of the tales of love, or of the love stories, were being composed. So Padmavat should also, in that sense, should be read against the background of these various narratives that were existing. And when the main character, the lead character of the story in Padmavat, Ratna Sen, Padmavati, they are having love affairs. There is a specific reference to some kind of a old narrative tradition that has allowed Jayasi to address these to the audience without any problem. You understand? So the audience is actually larger than the normal Sufi audience, and the choice of Avdi language also indicates Malik Muhammad Jayasi's more direct address to an audience which was much larger than that of the Persian courtly tradition. So that's why it is very important for us when we read Padmavat that we read it also as some with some kind of a literary context to it. So the literary context of Padmavat is very important, and that's why we say that Padmavat is actually located at the crossroad of various existing literatures, both Indian and Islamic. More people joining in, it seems. Okay. So, right. So Padmavat, that's why it's a literature which has influences coming from Nath Yogi poetries. It has influences coming from Persian mystic poetries, the existing heroic poetries, and that's why it has, for a historian today who reads such vernacular literature, they have to understand and try to figure out the specific models that have played a role in the composition of these literature. Now, before we move further, let me tell you a bit about the main story of the text. Why are people joining late? Now I won't allow anyone to join because it disturbs. Anyway, so Padmavati, basically in Padmavat, what you find is that Padmavati is the main character, and she's the daughter of Gandharva Sen. Somebody has raised a hand. Bruce Wayne. Yes, tell me.
Hello.
Yeah, can we have questions at the end?
Okay, sir.
Huh? You can keep your
Sure, sure.
questions. Yeah. Let's finish this first, and then we will have questions. So Padmavati basically is the main character of the story, and she's the daughter of Gandharv Sen, who is the king of Singal, and it is she's at a very tender age. She's given a palace, separate palace to live with her various friends, the Sakhiyas, and she becomes a friend with the parrot Hiraman. So that is also Hiraman is also a character who is a bird, and Padmavati and Hiraman are said to have they have read the Vedas together. So that is also there in the story, and the king also learns about it. The father of Padmavati learns about the proximity of his daughter with a bird, and so he actually plans to kill Hiraman. So before that, only Hiraman comes to know about it, and he flies away in the forest. Now, but then parrot is trapped by a bird catcher who is a जो उस समय it was known as Bahelia, and then the bird catcher then sells Hiraman, the parrot, to a Brahmin who takes him to Chittor. Ratan Sen is the king of Chittor at that time, who is another lead character in the story, and he is impressed with Hiraman's learning, the knowledge, and he buys Hiraman parrot from that Brahmin. So then Parrot, while he stays with Ratan Sen, he one day praises Padmavati, one of the most beautiful women of time, who lives in far off Single Dweep. So Ratan Sen then at that time thinks of, taking, getting in touch with Padmavati, and then the story also tells us about the kind of anguish of separation that we see in the Chittor fort, when because Ratna Sen is already a married man and he has a wife called Nagmati, so she becomes very angry when she hears about Ratan Sen's longing for Padmavati, whom he has never seen. So, these kind of episodes are also there in the story. But the main part of the story begins when Ratan Sen reaches there and tries to meet Padmavati, and then wins over Padmavati from the king of Single Dweep. And Ratan Sen is actually then able to marry Padmavati. Now, Alauddin Khalji too hears about there is an appearance of Alauddin Khalji as another lead character. And Alauddin Khalji also hears about the beauty of Padmavati. And he then vows to bring Padmavati to his harem. Now, Ratan Singh, of course, because now Padmavati is the wife of Ratan Singh, so he refuses, and a war takes place. Ratan Singh is then treacherously taken prisoner, and he is held a hostage for her surrender. But during the absence of Ratan Sen from Chittor, there is another king, neighboring king, who makes a proposal to Padmavati, and Padmavati rejects the proposal. And then you have a war going on in Chittor fort, where you have two protectors of Chittor, Gora and Badal, they fight the neighboring ruler. They then also get Ratan Sen released from imprisonment. And when Ratan Sen comes back, he tries to take revenge from the king of the neighboring kingdom, who was a king of the neighboring kingdom, who had given a proposal to Padmavati. But in this fight, both of them are wounded, and the two wives of Ratan Sen, Padmavati and Nagmati, they become sati for him. Now, Aladdin Khalji, meanwhile, invades Chittor fort. And that is also, as you know, this is a historical truth. I mean, there are many Persian chronicles which mention about it. So Alauddin invades Chittor fort in 1303, and Chittor is then defended by Gora and by one of them, Badal, who dies fighting at the gate. Now, Chittor is brought under Delhi Sultanate control, but the final verse of Padmavat is, which is written by Muhammad Jayasi, is that in which he says that despite this victory, Alauddin Khilji doesn't get anything. He doesn't achieve anything, because the main purpose was getting hold of Padmavati, which he has not been able to get. So there is some kind of a allegory that we find, a kind of a visual symbolic representation in the last section of Padmavati, and it is it is kind of a these characters like Padmavati or Ratan Sen. Many historians say that they have been used by the author as some kind of a metaphor. Now, the manuscript of Padmavat is, of course, as I mentioned, it is available in various scripts. Later on also it was then noted down in various scripts. Even there were different versions of Padmavat in Persian. They were also written down in Kathi. Later in the 17th century it was written in Bengali. So we find different versions of Padmavat later on. And all these variations, they suggest that there has been some kind of loose textual transmission, and this was because of the fact that the works of Sufi sheikhs at that time, they were transmitted from one generation to the next, and the copying were being done, copying of the original manuscript. And later on, as I mentioned in my last class, there were also some texts copied also for performance. So there were oral recitations also. And many a times this oral recitation might have then led to the variations in the text itself, which is of course a challenging task for a historian. But then, the later version, the manuscript of the later version, when it is compared to the earlier version, when these are compared, the historians are then able to figure out the difference. So the changes so there are in certain places changes in new vocabularies or introduction of new vocabularies in the later texts. Now, Malik Muhammad Jayasi himself belonged to a place called Jayas, which is near Amethi, and he has mentioned in Padmavat that he wrote it in 1540-41, and this is proven by the fact that he begins the poem with a kind of an eology for the silsila, the Sufi order, and the legends around Malik Muhammad Jayasi, which are there in those regions, which it is there in the popular tradition of Jayas region. They suggest that Malik Muhammad Jayasi actually emerged as a figure of a Sufi Pir after his death. And this happens normally to normally to many of the Sufi saints, because it is only after their death that they become popular and these shrines are created. So one of the legends also suggests that he died when he, turned himself into a tiger, and he was shot accidentally by King's hunter. So there are many stories related to popular stories related to Malik Muhammad Jayasi's. But so what we see is that Malik Muhammad Jayasi has actually entered into Sufi hagiographic literature almost a century later. And the popularity of his own Padmavat actually is much more. I mean, it is quite possible that it was much more in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. So, before its entry into the print, it might have been very popular. Now, as I mentioned, that there are elements of Masnavi in it. There are many of the elements of Masnavi has been taken by Malik Muhammad Jayasi, and in many of the Premakhyans, these Masnavi elements have been included. Now, for example, Ratan Sen, who is the king of North India, is making when he's making a journey to Singhaldweep. So, in order to marry a southern prince, he has a very specific purpose and meaning, and this actually is justified. It is actually justifying king's domination over the entire Indian subcontinent, and it actually is feeling quite similar to the idea of a Chakravarti king. So this is the whole these concepts of Chakravarti king were there in the earlier literatures also. A similar motif is also we can see in Ratnavalis, जो हर्ष का रत्नावली लिखा गया था, wherein you have a character Udayan who is the king. He desires to become the ideal Chakravarti Raja by marrying a princess from far off region. So this concept of that this kind of a theme, that a king of Chittor marrying a far off queen. So this is actually the author is actually then trying to interact with the local audience, who is already intelligible enough to understand, or who knows about such stories, who had already heard about these stories. So there were certain tropes that were taken from the narrative tradition of India. So I mentioned in my last class that there are many modern Hindi literature scholars. They are suggesting that scholars like Malik Muhammad Jayasi tried to send a wrong message through such extramarital relationship, which was not there in the Indian tradition, which is wrong. Actually, the extramarital relations like Nal Damayanti and Usha Anirudh, they were already there. So through the use of these local or narrative tradition, Malik Muhammad Jayasi is intending to actually address an audience which is larger, much larger than the normal Persian audience. And similarly, we have references to Sati. So Amir Khusro also has mentioned at one point about Sati as the supreme example of love at that time, although today we know that Sati has been treated as something very cruel for the woman. So that kind of study is also there in modern time. But then the reference of Sati after the death of Ratan Sen is an extension of this Sufi tradition of the 14th century. So all these references, they should be seen in terms of the Sufi idea, main idea of the principle of love, which is very deep, which Sufism always suggested that it would come only through suffering. So that is why at one point, in the story, Ratna Sen is also ready to burn himself when he's stopped by, at one point when he's going towards Single Dweep, he's stopped by, so God Shiva tries to, test him. So, and then he's stopped by Shiva and Parvati, but then he he's ready to burn himself. Now this is kind of a suffering that the character is allowed to go through, which is also the principle of love of Sufism. So the immolation or the kind of sati that we see, or the episode of sati that we see in Padmavati, or even Nagmati who goes through sati, is actually quite similar to the Sufi idea of the supreme sacrifice, the fana. So and in fact, if you read Aditya Pali, very emphatically writes that it, in which we should read these literature in which you have a contest going on between the supreme political power and the Sufi saints, and wherein you find that there is a contest which is quite similar to a contest that is about a love which is rightfully gained or achieved, and a love which is achieved through violence. So, the poet, in fact, if we read it carefully, Aditya Bahal thinks that, and many historians later on suggest similarly, that it is sending a clear message to the political elites about the symbolic independence of Sufi silsila. Despite the fact that many of the Sufis they depended or they relied on many of the kings, but then the sultans, but then the same elites also relied on the Sufis for patronage. Now when we go deep into this whole issue of the elements of or the influences that are coming from different literature, one of the important influences coming from the earlier narratives, the Chaupai Doa format that we find in the literature. On the screen you can see there is one section from this is from Grierson's translation of Padmavat, and therein you have, in the entire text you will find such Chaupai followed by a Doha going on. So this is a text about, it tells us about, Shershah and how Shershah is so very powerful, and how, so in a way, the author is trying to suggest that Shershah should be considered as a powerful king. We'll come back to this point a little later. But, coming back to the, the influences that are coming, Padmavat, in some sense, poses some kind of special, it's a special kind of a story, because if we read the entire story, we find that in the first part, Padmavat and Ratna Sen's relationship is mentioned, and then there is emphasis on yoga or mythical love also. Mystical love also. And the main theme of the first part, when Ratna Sen goes towards Simbal Dweep, it these kind of long journeys, the stories related to long journeys, were already existing in Indian literature in various forms. And the most, in fact, classical example of this kind of a long journey episode is found in Harsha's Ratnavali, which tells us about the king Udayan, who who then becomes a Chakravarti Raja when he's able to govern the Indian, entire large territory of India. Now, Udayan, when you read Ratnavali, you find that Udayan is marrying, and he is able to achieve this marriage only when he comes through a dangerous journey. Now, this image of the king who becomes also a yogi, so a yogi element is also then given in the Padmavat literature. And this is also coming from somewhere, some Indian oral earlier existing literatures. Now, the Sufi poets place this concept of love in narrative form, which was also known to the Indian audience. For example, the Nath Yogi stories were already popular, and the Nath Yogis operated in the same, eco-cultural zone in which now the Padmavat was being written, or many other Sufi literatures were, many other Premakhyans were being written. So it's the same middle Gangetic ecological and cultural sphere. And so this story connects the work with a broad variety of literary themes which are associated with Rajput culture, and also it gives some kind of political message, political subtext to the story. So it uses various themes which are associated with the Rajput warriors of the time, and through inclusion of a Rajput story, Malik Muhammad is actually in a way trying to establish a connection with the audience. So the motif of beautiful Padmini, which was already there in Prithviraj Raso. So if you read Chand Bardai's Prithviraj Raso, so there the queen is Padmini, not Padmavati, and so Padmini is the princess, so the wife of the Rajput king, who was already popular in the Rajasthani epic literatures like Prithviraj Raso. So another very interesting element from Rajput culture that provides a background for Ratna Sen's, his longing or his quest for love, is the whole concept of Digvijay, that when the king actually travels and to far off areas. So the motif of marriage, which is also present in various earlier Sanskrit tales, was established political practice among the ruling elites during those days, and this was imbibed by Malik Muhammad Jayasi. Now, the control of fortress of Chittor, which was where the Chauhan dynasty was ruling. Now, this is the second part of the story. So, in the second part of the story, the main thrust is on Alauddin Khalji's invasion and how Alauddin Khalji tries to take control of Chittor, and also how he wanted to take control of the queen Padmini. So, and then you have this story related to Sati, the Sati of Padmavati. Now, Amir Khusro's reference of Sati, he has mentioned about it. He does mention that, the Padmini story was kind of a very popular story in heroic tales, but not exactly that of Padmavati, because Padmavati was not composed by that time. So you find similar kind of a queen existing in Indian literatures at that time. Now the representation of Padmini theme should also be then, therefore, I mean, many historians argue, particularly if you read the work of Ramya Srinivasan, Many Lives of Queen, she mentions about the adaptation of Rajput idioms which had been imbibed by Malik Muhammad Jayasi, the authors like Muhammad Jayasi. And she describes the role of Padmini theme uh, and the Battle of Chittor in to connect the local audience with the existing literatures about the queen like Padmini. So, in fact, Ramya Srinivasan gives a very, the Chaupai and Doha that you find here on the screen is actually also glorifying Shershah and mentioning that how Shershah is so very powerful a ruler. So basically, if we can also see such texts being written with some political context. So it is in this is a time period when Shershah is trying to increase his authority, and Shershah was perceived as a real threat at that time, and that's why the poet Malik Muhammad Jayasi is he has located his mystical tale in an imagined Rajput environment also. So this is how Ramya Srinivasan sees it. So she argues that why there is a specific Rajput element or Rajput idiom in the story of Malik Muhammad Jayasi, because it is also politically a political text. It's a text which was written with a political motive, because Shershah Suri, under whom this text was written, through this text Shershah wanted to possibly send a message. Now these are different variety of interpretations that we see in these literatures, the modern day literatures. As I mentioned, that there is also a Nath Yogi imagery that we find. So Nath Yogi, there were many concepts like the yogi concept. This is also there in many of the episodes that we find in Malik Muhammad Jayasi's Padmavat, because at one point you find that Ratna Sen is then ready to become a yogi also. In fact, if you read Ramcharitmanas, Tulsidas also uses many of the images that originate from Nath Yogi concept, such as the devotion to the name of Ram. So Nath Yogi imagery is also an important element in Padmavat, and that is why you have episodes like Ram and references like Ram and Sita in many of the episodes of Padmavat. Then we have already talked about the Masnavi element that we find. At many points you find that Padmavat mentions, compares Alauddin Khalji to Ravan. So you have these references to Ram, Sita, Ravan, which are actually very much popular in Indian narrative tradition, and then such Ram Katha tradition is also found reference in Padmavat. So the tale of Ram um, it was already a very important tale. It was very popular among the masses, and in fact, they have been compared with Ram and Sita, the two characters, Padmavati and Ratnasen. They have been compared with the Ram and Sita. So he uses the author has used the elements from the complex Ram stories that we already have, which was there popular among the audience. So there is a familiarity of the people with such stories. So when so the famous episode of Ram Sita in the exile of Ravan in Lanka is also found reference here. So Alauddin Khalji is often compared with Ravan in the narrative. So in many of the chaupais you will find that when Padmavati and Nagmati, when they are ready to go to the Chitta, they want to do supreme sacrifice, they are referred to as, Ratnasen is no more there, and when Alauddin Khalji encircles the fortress, he is then referred to as Ram, and then Padmavati is referred as Sita. So both have Ram and Sita have vanished. So this kind of a reference is also there. So the attempt by Alauddin Khalji of capturing Padmavati goes in vain, and then Alauddin Khalji in that sense is compared to Ravan. So Ravan wants to take control of Sita, and he is not able to take control of Sita. So such references are also coming from the existing Ram stories that were there during those years. Now let us now come back to another interesting aspect, that is about the mythical Padmavati. Now, if one reads the 17th century, chronicle, Rajasthani literatures, particularly if you read Munat Nancy's Khyat, the Khyat literature talks about Jayasi's version of Padmavat. That means, the Khyat literature, Munat Nancy's Khyat was written in 17th century, early 17th century or something. And by that time, Padmavat had already entered into the popularity. So that's why, the Munat Nancy's Khyat is also referring to Jayasi's version of Padmavat's story. And then it refers to the sack of Chittorgarh fort by Alauddin Khalji. Now, later on, what you find is that James Todd, who wrote Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan in the 19th century, he also then explains the story of Queen Padmini and the tragic resistance of the defenders of Chittor. But interestingly, these two references and many other, Rajasthani literature keep on mentioning about the invasion of Chittorgarh fort by Alauddin Khilji and Padmini surviving that invasion by doing a sati or jawar. Now, you see, this kind of a story then enters into a popular narrative later on from 17th century. So even today, when you go to Chittorgarh fort, the the tourist guide would tell you about these stories. But as historians, we have to read these narratives with a pinch of salt, because none of the earlier contemporary literatures from Rajasthan ever talk about Padmini as a queen or Ratan Sen as a king. So none of the even contemporary Persian sources mention about Padmavati. So before 17th century, when Munat Nancy's Khyat was written, you don't find any of the literature mentioning or talking about Padmavati. Now that's something which hurts the sentiments of the Rajputs of Rajasthan. When you say this, it hurts the sentiment, because they are sentimentally attached to Padmini as a queen. But the historical reality is this. So there is a difference. So Padmini is actually an important character. It is an important revered character in Rajasthan, and there is no doubt. But the point is, for as a historian, we should understand that this has come only after the 17th century. Now, none of the contemporary Persian sources mention about Padmavati. None of the Rajasthani sources before 17th century mention about Padmavati. Even if you read Amir Khusro's Khazainul Futu, it does mention Ratan Sen, but it says he has an individual and his family were spared after the conquest of Chittor. And then after the conquest of Chittor, Khizr Khan was made who was the son of Alauddin Khilji. He was made the governor. So that's why Chittor fort after that was known as Khizrabad. And even literatures like Burni or Isami, who has been a witness to Alauddin Khilji's rule, they are silent about Padmavati. So the question then arises that why Malik Muhammad Jayasi makes possession of Padmavati such an important issue in the story. So there were possibly two reasons behind it. One could be that he had possibly read the story of Prithviraj Raso, which he did actually, he might have, because that was already there in the popular tradition. So he read he might have read Prithviraj Raso of Chand Badai, and he might also have read Amir Khusro's Deval Rani Khizr Khan, which is also a very important Persian text which was written by Amir Khusro in 1316. And then he might also have read about Padmanabh's Kanaddet Prabandh, which was written in 15th century. So all these literatures acted as a background for Malik Muhammad Jayasi. So through this kind of a narrative of Padmavati, Malik Muhammad Jayasi wanted to impress an audience which was largely non-Islamic. So that's why in the first part of Padmavat, we find that it is the story is influenced by Prithviraj Raso and Prithviraj Chauhan and Padmini story, wherein Prithviraj is falling in love with Padmini, and when Padmini's father fixed the marriage with some other prince, she sends a message through a parrot. So even in Prithviraj Raso, you have such kind of a similar story. And then Prithviraj comes with an army and wins over Padmini. So that is why Padmavati is a lead heroine in Jayasi's character, which is because it was already there in many of the existing literature. Now the second part of the Padmavat story is actually taking influence from Amir Khusro's Deval Rani Khizr Khan, and Kanadet Praban, which are stories about the sacrifice in love. And because that was already there in the popular narratives. Now, in there you find that there is a story of sacrifice of Khizr Khan for Deval Rani. So, Deval Rani and Khizr Khan were in love. That's the main storyline of Amir Khusro's Deval Rani Khizr Khan story. And then there is another, I told you about this, the passionate love of Firoza, Alauddin Khilji's daughter, for Kanadet's son in Kanadet Praban. So interestingly, both Khizr Khan and Firoza, they were children of Alauddin Khilji, and in both these literatures you find that there is a, the story actually revolves around this sacrifice for two different characters belonging to two different religions. And then in Deval Rani Khizr Khan there has been a sacrifice done by Deval Rani. So because of the influence from these two texts, Malik Muhammad Jayasi is possibly talking about the sacrifice by Padmavati after the death of Ratan Sen. So another very important aspect of Jayasi's Padmavat is that he chooses a story from a very distant, far-off land, and you see that he's actually writing in an eco-cultural environment of Uttar Pradesh, Eastern Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar. So for them, the older stories might not have been accessible at that time, but they must have heard about these stories. But then, the landscapes which is referred to in Padmavat is quite a familiar landscape to the Avadi audience, where a lot of rain takes place. There are thick wood, jungles all around, water flowing through the rivers. So all this is there in the Padmavat story, and this kind of a the connect that the author wants to do is an interesting and important part when we study the literatures of that time. So overall, what we see is that as many of the writings of the modern day scholars, which is inadvertently influenced by Ranke's idea of facts, positivism, wherein he used to say that how it really was, that how the fact was. So the value of a text was done only was realized only through empirical data that the text provided, which unfortunately such vernacular texts like Padmavat do not provide. So if we try to look at the content of the text as like for example Padmini or Padmavati as the real character, then it is a problem. So basically, to that end, what we see is that if we avoid such kind of historical anachronisms, which the vernacular literatures are often criticized for, we can use these texts as some kind of a literary references, a composition of medieval time, which is also very important. So we go into the details of why the text was written, what was the political context, why different influences are coming, from where these influences are coming. So